Hello, everyone. Good to see you.
Hello,
Well,
people joining so far.
yes.
Yeah, we'll begin in a couple of minutes as we wait for people to join the Zoom. So just give us a minute or so. Okay, I think we'll start now. So just to begin, my name is Simon Clark. I work in the EGU office as a projects manager, looking at science communication and science policy and community development, amongst other things. Um, and today our webinar is going to focus on EU public consultations, how to answer a EU Commission consultation. Leading us today is Kelsey Beltz, who leads partnership and education for the Good Lobby. We'll be sharing their expertise. So just some housekeeping remarks. If you have a question for the panelists ourselves, please enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. You can also upvote questions you think should be answered there as well. And so we'll go through the presentation, about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll give time for discussion and Q&A at the end afterwards. All in all, the webinar should take about an hour in length. And it is being recorded. So if you want to return to the subjects, it'll be published on our YouTube channel in the next few weeks. So keep out for that if you want to visit the topic as well. Otherwise, I'll now pass on to Kelsey.
Perfect. Thank you, Simon. And thank all of you who are making time out of your busy days to join us on a subject that is not always the coolest subject or the subject you think of first, but it's extremely important to be able to articulate especially your policy goals and also translate your research into policy. So I'm very happy to talk about today EU public consultation. So who is the Good Lobby? I won't spend too much time on this, but just a brief, perhaps you've noticed that our name has lobbying in it. We are actually an NGO, so we're not professional lobbyists, but our goal is to really democratize lobbying to make our systems more equal, because we feel that if you're not able to vocalize your own work and research, of course, we're always going to be below some of the corporate lobbying standards. So we founded this NGO in 2016 to essentially do some of the things that I'm doing today, like trainings as well as strategic advice to civil society. I've also trained Simon and Chloe, working with scientists, to essentially make sure that we can all counterbalance what seems to be an increasingly heavy weight of corporate lobbying. And also at the same time, we do research to make sure that the lobbying system itself is more ethical and responsible. So it's kind of a top-down, bottom-up effort. So from the top down, we try to regulate lobbying, and from the bottom up, we try to give you tools like the tools that I'll be presenting today. And if you're interested in the Good Lobby, I will be not only sharing the slides, but I'll also share our contact so you can browse through our website. And if something resonates with you or a project that you're working on, we'll be more than happy to be in touch to see how we can help you. But moving on from ourselves, is what is a public consultation? I'm guessing that many of you joined this session because you are interested in a public consultation or you've submitted to one, but for some of you, it might be your very first time. So essentially, a public consultation is exactly what it sounds like at an EU level or at a national level. It's basically saying, we are thinking about making a law. How exactly should we make this law in a way that's beneficial to the citizens? And it's an opportunity, kind of like a town hall in some senses, to actually give your feedback to the policymakers. So this could be a revision of a law that already exists, especially at EU level. Maybe there's something that is really not working and you'd like to give your advice. It could also be a brand new law. And so maybe you're giving your advice about how they should shape that law. And the idea, as implied, is basically to have everyone, including scientists, and I would like to have more scientists involved, to have their say. And that's the name of the EU platform that I'll also be linking to you. But it's the idea that anytime we should be doing anything legislative, of course, we should ask citizens, scientists, professionals, everyone to actually say what they think about it. And just as a brief revision, so the European Commission is the only EU institution with the power to start legislation. So that's why the EU Commission is the one that actually activates these types of consultations. So they basically draft the law, and then it goes through the Parliament and through the council, but that's a very separate topic that I will not make you miss your lunches over. But just in general, that's the reason that it's on the commission website. They have the power to revise or introduce legislation. And so that's why they're asking citizens what they think about for this legislation. So why should you take time out of your busy day and discuss with the EU Commission? First things first, make your voice heard. They're never going to necessarily, the policymakers won't necessarily read your research unless you're having one-on-one outreach. It's actually a way where you're able to give your perspective, and they're asking for it because most politicians are not necessarily, especially scientific experts. So they're basically reaching out to say, hey, here's what we're thinking about, but please tell us exactly what to do. People forget about that sometimes with lobbying. They're actually asking for your opinions and your research. So it's very important, especially as scientists, that you're able to give this really concrete research to policymakers who might not necessarily have the time or energy. And then to balance reputation of interest, this really comes back to what I was first saying. Some people say, oh, I don't want to lobby, I'm not politically engaged. But what I would respond to that is that whether or not you decide to engage politically, other people are 100% engaging politically and lobbying. So if you would like your findings or your opinions or your policy suggestions to be heard, it's in your best interest to engage, because even if you say, I don't do that, everybody else is doing it. And that's how we lead to this often imbalanced aspect of power, where the corporations and the professional lobbying firms are absolutely doing it. So it's definitely in your own interest to try to represent your voice. It's good to be part of a broader strategy. It doesn't mean you have to have a full lobbying strategy, but this could actually be a first step, because by going through the consultations, you can actually start to see the questions the Commission and the EU are asking, and that might actually help you form your strategy. So moving beyond research into something a bit more politically engaged, that could be a great first step. And you can also see what are the priorities, how can I best shape those after the consultation, who should I engage with, how can I engage with them in the language that they're specifically using, which is very important. And also to communicate with others on the same topic. So the consultations are public. It's not like Facebook or Instagram. People won't message you about your consultation response, but you can use it as a communication aspect to show that you did respond, to see who responded perhaps similarly to you, to see how you might join forces, to see perhaps who communicated in a way that you completely disagree with. But it's also, given the fact that it's very public, as the name implies, it can actually be a nice tool to figure out your stakeholder mapping and see, who should I be teaming up with, who should I be keeping an eye on. And I think that's a very valuable aspect as well. So after you prepare your response, you can also read the responses of others and kind of see where people sit on the issue. I think we can keep going, and I'll just hold all questions to the end. A big question is who can participate. As you can probably hear from my accent, I am American, though I've been in the EU for 10 years. And the answer is actually non-EU citizens can also participate. So it's really everyone and anyone. They put you into categories. So you have to say, I'm an EU citizen, I'm a business, I'm an NGO, and you submit on behalf of different people. But you can also just submit on behalf of being a citizen or a scientist, your research organization. So it's very open. And depending on the topic, you might see how much this changes. So for instance, we worked on due diligence directive, which has to do with supply chains. And there was a lot of submissions, obviously, from non-EU citizens because they were coming from other countries down the supply chains. Whereas for other ones, you might find 99% are from EU citizens. But just to say that anyone and everyone can contribute to these. And you can contribute as an individual, as a researcher, or as an organization, as a university. The results are public, so don't say anything you don't want to be Google searched if someone's coming to find you. But that's also, like I said, part of the benefit of it. So you can see who responded. They break it down by category, they break it down by country. And it's really interesting if you're passionate about this subject, because you can really see who exactly took the time to do such a thing. So there's different kinds of consultations, and I will not go super in depth to all of these. What I will say is we have a free guide that I will share at the end that you can download and read at your leisure that will be a bit more in depth. But there's a few different kinds of feedback. So all of this is going through the European Commission website. And you might log into the European Commission website, as I did, this morning and kind of have a heart attack because you see a lot of comments that are completely not what you're looking for, but that is citizen feedback. So anyone with an email address who's interested in a certain directive can submit a comment. It doesn't have to be verified and it doesn't go through the official consultation process. So sometimes I was looking at what I'll show you, the Democracy Shield website, and I said, wow, 89% of the responses are from Slovakia and they all hate democracy. So there's a little bit of a bot issue there. But when it comes to the actual consultations, that you have to have an official EU registry. You can log in, you can create one and it's authenticated. So it goes either through the EU app or it goes through your phone, so you know that it's real. So for the following ones, those are ones that you would have more of a formal submission. So roadmap is basically the commission has decided either to revise a current legislation or they want to propose something brand new. And it's basically asking you advice. What would you do if you were proposing this law? How will this affect you, etc. So it's very much the early phase. And then impact assess, and they often ask that because they're trying to figure out how exactly they want to propose their legislation. Impact assessment is a bit more detailed, but I think quite relevant to the scientific community because perhaps they've already decided on a legislation, but they don't know the impact. So especially when it comes to environmental issues, you may have very, very valuable research and data that could really kind of turn the corner about how they create this law because they are not scientists, they're political scientists. So impact assessment is slightly more detailed and they don't always ask everyone for feedback, but it is part of the public consultation process. And you, especially as scientists, could probably offer a lot of this if you have like legitimate data to tell them, do this, don't do that. Public consultation is essentially what we're talking about today, but it usually comes after the roadmap. So the idea is that they've basically already decided on what law they're going to write. They have a draft, but they want to hear citizens' feedback on it, scientists' feedback, NGO feedback from our side. So this is the type of thing, you find them all on the same website, but this is a bit more targeted because they have the law. So it's more about you responding to their criteria. And I'll give you an example in a moment, but this is probably the most useful place to give your advice if you're not invited for the impact assessment. There's also opportunity to draft a legal act, although I would highly suggest not to do that unless you're a legal professional. I would stick mostly to roadmap, impact assessment, and public consultation. And now we'll go into an example of what those might look like. So here's an example. Some people say, I have so much to say, but I actually don't know where to find any of this. So at the end of this PowerPoint, you'll find actually the link to the Have Your Say part of the commission. And you can see, for instance, what's closing, what's opening. You can also sign up for email registration. They send them inexplicably at like 1 in the morning, but you can wake up and have your coffee and see what's opening. And so you can see also the timeline, and everything again is very transparent in terms of what they're asking. So this is something you can browse on the website or sign up for notifications. Here's an example. This is one that the Good Lobby is quite involved on. So the Democracy Shield. So you can see when it opened, you can see the period they're collecting consultation feedback, and you can also see who's working on it and what basically the summary is. And then ideally, once you submit the feedback, it'll go to that next step where it says commission adoption, or it gives you a report on how it was adopted. But this is an example, and you can search based on your own sort of priorities, but it gives you a summary, it gives you a very clear window of when things are being collected, and then at the bottom of this you would be able to click and give your feedback once you have an EU website essentially. And this is an example of what you might see. So when I say the consultations are much more in depth than the just feedback comments, it's because they'll really ask you a whole set of questions. Each question will be different depending on the consultation, but this is just kind of an example. So you'll have the scale from 1 to 5, and then you'll also, for various, they can get quite long. And then you'll also have the opportunity to give qualitative feedback. And I think that's really valuable, and that's something you should definitely prepare in advance. So you'll give essentially your rating from 1 to 5 on various questions, but then you also have the opportunity to give some more qualitative remarks. You also have the opportunity, and I know you scientists, you have the opportunity to attach documents. Do not attach a 300-page research document. but we'll get to this. You could attach, for instance, an external document, especially if it's a policy paper or a very brief one, so that it's not just a scale of 1 to 5. And this is what it would look like for basically every consultation, and this is what would look like when you log in. This is what I was warning you about the feedback. I'm laughing at myself. So obviously, like I said, you might see feedback that doesn't look wonderful, but these are just comments. I highly doubt that any of them actually filled out the entire 200-page form, but just a warning that there's a difference between the feedback section, where everybody hates my work, and also the people who take the time to do the really full consultation where you need a verified email and phone number to log in. So don't despair if you see something you hate. So why is this good? Well, it's direct participation, and that can be good or bad. Participation is based on the people participating, so I think it's a really important step in democracy that we're able to ask citizens. Even when I see a line from someone I completely disagree with, I say, okay, they took the time to go to that website and make a remark. So at least there's something participative. Again, if we don't do this, then we're going to be drowned out by business interests, by other types of special interests, increasingly think tanks and lobbying firms. So might as well have your voice heard. And it can also be a part of a broader communication strategy. So you can really leverage on this, also including with meetings with policymakers, to say, I did take the time to respond to this. Here are the key points of my response. And it makes you a little bit more, shall we say, legitimate in terms of understanding, in terms of pitching yourself, because you really took the time to have well-crafted responses to submit, and you can even pull up or print your response when you go to a meeting with a policymaker. I would encourage having a cover page for that and not having them read the whole thing, but you can say, here are my key points. Here's my submission. It also means that other people can see your submission, so you can sometimes triangulate relationships in terms of people might say, I actually had this happen recently on the AI Act, where they said, we saw that you submitted this and we have the same opinion, can we meet? You have to be a kind of special type of person like I to go through all of the answers to the transparency register and to the public consultations, but it does happen, and it can definitely be used to leverage, particularly if you're trying to have a meeting with a policymaker, if you're trying to see who your allies are, to say, yeah, we have a similar opinion, let's do this. And I think, you have to take the time to comb through it, but that's part of why it's so beautiful that it's public. Bad news, it's EU, so it's time consuming. It's not the most easy platform to use. That's why I would definitely advise that you kind of work on this in advance, like download the questions as a PDF and come up with your answers. Because if you try to do all of this in one day, sometimes we take a month. So just download the questions, discuss with your team, think about how it's going to work, and then make sure that you have the most concise questions possible. It can be increasingly technical, especially legally. So sometimes there's a lot of legal jargon that you don't really understand. In that case, I would definitely, I think many of you may be in organizations that have legal consultation. We also work with pro bono requests. So if you're working on something that seems incredibly legally challenging, just maybe it's always best to ask a lawyer rather than submit something that you're not 100% sure of. There is still a major imbalance of interests, because coming back to being time consuming, the people that have time to submit a bajillion requests are the people that have massive public affairs firms, because they have an entire team essentially dedicated to public consultations. Whereas if you're at a small research university, if you're self-employed, if you're, even at the Good Lobby, this really takes a chunk out of our time. So there's still going to be an imbalance if there's 25 people submitting on behalf of one group and I'm typing away in the 3 hours I have that I've dedicated to this. Of course, you're going to have an imbalance, but at the same time, I do think it's really important to at least try to keep it up, knowing that you're probably up against a somewhat Herculean force, but if you don't do it, then it's even worse. No guarantee. Welcome to the EU. There is no guarantee that your needs will be met. The Commission will not send you an email saying, we've taken all of your work into account. It's too big, it's too broad, and as you'll see if you browse, there's thousands of submissions. So it doesn't mean necessarily that it will be listened to, but it does mean it will be considered. And I do still maintain some hope in the commission and the fact that, especially with scientists, and the more thorough you can be citing different things, I do think they'll actually take that into consideration much more than other groups, because I think there's a bit of a lack of scientists in politics right now. So there's actually a chance that they might follow up with you, that they might invite you to be part of one of those roadmap groups or expert groups, because they're really kind of thirsty for scientific data. A lot of the submissions are very political. I think scientific data would actually be more successful. And yeah, as with everything, just try not to make any submissions that might disqualify you. I think mostly you should be safe and sound, but just make sure that everything is essentially submitted as it should be. You double check all the categories so that they can't chuck it to the side and basically have you do all that work for nothing. So tips. When do you want to receive alerts? You can sign up on their website. Like I said, they will come at 1 in the morning. It's up to you at which hour you would like to respond, but at least you have basically an overview of what are being launched. If you're working on something actively already on the website that I share, you can search by keyword. So if you're working on a specific topic, you can look and see based only on that topic if there's anything going. Start early. This is my biggest advice, because it seems like it should be easy to fill out a form, but because you want your takeaways to be as thorough yet concise as possible, I really suggest that you start at least a month early. Really, especially if you're going to offer a sort of qualitative text, nail that down with your team, make it super, super understandable for those who are not scientific experts. And if there's something very legal that's confusing, consider a pro bono professional. And you can attach a document. Please make it no longer than 5 pages. Think of it like a scientific cover letter. They were not going to read a 200-page dissertation. So think about basically a 5-page letter that contextualizes your answers, if you think that's reasonable. If there's no need for that, you don't have to do it. You can just keep it all very tight in the qualitative answer boxes. If you don't have an answer to one opinion, I think you can put NA. I think it's better than saying something you don't know. This comes back to the legal stuff. So if you don't want to sort of implicate yourself in a legal question, you can put NA, but I still think the more robust the answers, the better. So if you can't find a lawyer, just say NA rather than kind of going through it, because the legal questions can get a little bit sticky. And again, using it as part of a larger lobbying strategy. So this should not be your only engagement with politicians, because it's not. It needs to be triangulated through all these other tactics, which I'm happy to talk about more. But it can't just be, I submitted this consultation and now I'm waiting and I'm looking forward to them incorporating all of my suggestions. It needs to be very much like, I submitted it, now I'm looking at the policymakers, now I'm looking at the other groups that also submitted, now I'm trying to schedule meetings, because it's not very much a living document. It's part of a broader strategy. And then explain your data. I should have bolded that even further. So you have to explain why your data matters, directly related to the questions that they're asking. Do not submit something that's just because it's a paper that you've written. You have to explain how it relates to every single point that you can browse when you look at the questions they're asking. Why should they listen to you? Why are you the voice that should say this? That will overall, in any part of your lobbying or advocacy strategy, get you much farther than just saying, like, here's my research. You have to say, I related this to point 7. Here's my findings on point 8. Here's why I rated this a 4 and not a 3. Like, make it as specific as possible. And I'm almost done, and then I see we have some questions. So in general, like I said, I will share the slides, and you can peruse the platform. And then we have our how-to guide, which you can download for free from our website. And with that, I think we can probably go to questions. Is that fine for you, Simon?
Yes, that works really well. Thank you, Kelsey. So we'll move to questions now. Please type your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, where we can I'll moderate them, but also we can also upvote questions which are interesting to you. But I want to start just by asking, what should scientific evidence or scientific communication look like when they're adding this evidence to a call? You say, of course, it needs to be short. It shouldn't be a research paper. But I guess there's going to be some level of technicality that might be involved, even in terms of format or aesthetics. If it's makes more aesthetically pleasing, is that taken into consideration, for example?
I don't think you need to be so worried about aesthetically pleasing the European Commission, but but I do think coming back to my point about it being a cover letter, I think if you think about applying for a job, you reference specific words and specific points that they used in their call. And I think it's similar with some of these public consultations. Like you echo the language that they're using. And I would really think of it as a cover letter. Not you can bring your research into it, but it needs to be a summary of what you've already essentially said. I think if your research has a lot of visualization, for instance, that would be a great thing to attach because you're not going to be able to type that into the sections. But I would clearly list what visualization links to what. So if you have a graph, you can say this is related to my point on, question 3. This is related to my point on question 4. This is a visualization of what I mentioned. I just think making sure that everything is clearly linked to something that they're asking for. I do think having it be visually appealing makes sense in that if you have a bunch of graphs and data, but clearly link it because it might not even be the same person who reads the proposal and who's reading your other things. So I think it's good just the more clear, the better, and also parroting their language a little bit. So this is my response to your question rather than just presenting what's already there.
Sure. So I guess it's the difference between scientists thinking something should change in policy and contributing versus scientists identifying a policy need and wrapping their kind of expertise around that in a way. Yeah.
Yeah, and you don't have to dilute your research. I just think that if people tend to react better when they hear their own needs echoed back, and the poor interns that have to collect 2,000 submissions are looking for buzzwords. So you can keep your same, research and say this is what I know, but I would just make sure that you use the buzzwords and clarify what you're reacting to rather necessarily than creating something totally new.
Sure. So make sure it's clear, both in terms of formats and the graphics you use, the points you're addressing, and try and keep it somewhat short. Yeah.
Yeah. 5 pages
Um,
was generous. I usually say 2, but you guys can have 5 because of visuals.
so so even 2 pages perhaps might be the best limit if we want people to go through all those. I suppose it's almost like vetting for an interview, right? You go through a lot of CVs, etc. You need to find ones that hit the buzzwords, which are consumable as well and digestible. We did have a question from the audience about the share of responses of institutions versus perhaps companies or lobbyists answering a call. Is that a visible thing, or is it something that's gained perhaps more through informal knowledge?
No, so for each consultation, they will say the responses, and you can see them visualized in graph form. I think, as with many things, sometimes people kind of not falsely report, but they might say they're an NGO and they're really a think tank or something. But in general, no, you can actually see a breakdown, and that's one of the most interesting things, depending on the subject. Like I said, you can see breakdown by the person who responded. You can also see nationality, which is very important at EU level. If everybody in Slovakia hates this, but everybody in France loves it. So all of that is visualized on the website, and it's really interesting, particularly if you submit or if you're interested in past submissions, to see who voted where. And I think for me, what's been most interesting is seeing percentage of non-EU citizens versus EU, because like I said, on certain directives, like involving due diligence, there was a huge uptick in the countries that were not EU. So it's definitely interesting to peruse. I can add this to the follow-up, but you can also, there's some resources available to see who's meeting with who, various policymakers, and that could also be interesting as you're preparing your response to see who's talking about these issues.
Sure. Thank you. So it's definitely like route forward in terms of, I guess that's also how you build up your networks as well, really. You're trying to find out who to contact, where to build up connections with for future work. Just going back to the scientific evidence side of things, how are responses incorporated into the policies in the end? I guess you mentioned before it might not be so transparent if they take in your advice or not, but they could contact you again.
Yes, and for this, it's not necessarily an exact science. So when you have, for instance, a petition or a European Citizens Initiative, they're required to give you a response, whereas they're not required to give you a response to how they incorporated the feedback, which is why I think it's good to be as thorough as possible. So there's not necessarily a ranking system. And part of what keeps it so democratic is, someone who has very little experience will have the same theoretically procedure that you have for the consultations. If you're invited to participate in one of the sort of roadmap brainstormings or working on some of the impact assessment, you would have a personal invitation. So then you would be in personal contact with them and you would know that they had kind of seen your work and it's piqued their interest. When it comes to public consultations, it's weighted the same. Long live democracy. So, don't expect them to email you back. I think the best case scenario, especially for scientists, would be if you did get an email back saying, we were super excited about your submission and we'd like to have you as part of our expert group or working group, etc. But the first step, public consultations, is very equalized, shall we say.
So in the formal process, there's not really any weight given to a evidence that's submitted just because it's a scientific one. You have to compete with all the other submissions as well, which are perhaps less evidence-based. Yeah.
Precisely. And the person reviewing it might, see the name of the submission and see your beautiful, beautiful, very short and concise evidence and say, oh, wow, this is great, but there's no formal process to have to do that. It's more, they might recontact you, you might become part of a working group, or they might just say, oh, I agree with this, but they're not going to necessarily respond to you, and there's no formal process to weigh the submissions out of the democratic principle of citizens initiative.
Do you think then there's a bit of a block in a way for people who want to participate then? I think one of the questions asked is, in your opinion, is scientific participation low because it's a time-consuming process? So I guess that's the first question. I would also say there's a following up question, perhaps. Is there another way to engage with decision-making policymakers outside of that formal consultation, which perhaps could also jump on? But yeah.
Yeah, so I see a question also in the chat of initial registration, and I'll share with you these slides that have the link, and basically you just have to, register via the website, show that you're a real person, which is what we want in these consultations. It's much nicer to have real people and not bots. And then I'll also share the sign up link for alerts. And like I said, you might not care about every single alert that you get. Half the time I just delete it, but at least then you can see, and I'll share those links. It's just the website, the Commission Have Your Say website, and you can sign up fairly easily. And like I said, you can also browse by topic and subject of interest. So if you're working on something, and indeed, I think they're part of a broader process. That's why I mentioned the broader advocacy or lobbying strategy. I think it's something that can be useful. I don't think that should be your whole political strategy. I think that you should also be triangulating with a communication strategy. It doesn't have to be a full-blown campaign, but trying to reach out perhaps more one-on-one to different political actors at different levels. It can be national, it can be commission, it could be MEPs, but just hitting send on the consultation will not probably get you where you're hoping. But as I said, it really can help in terms of they will incorporate the feedback, at least in some regard, and then you can use it and see who else is using it and try to set up maybe some one-on-one meetings, try to say maybe like a press release saying the key points from your consultation. You don't have to copy paste like I did with the multiple choice, but you can, say, we submitted to this public consultation, here are demands, and then you can tag people that are of interest, or you can use that to reach out to people. So it's really kind of the baseline. And it can, I would build on that rather than take that as that was my political contribution.
Sure. So the consultation is the formal way to kind of get that evidence considered, perhaps use also other formal and informal ways. I guess informal ways would be, for example, press statements, like you said, or perhaps even writing a policy brief. Another example is an informal way to say, hey, this is our evidence, and perhaps we send that to the right people. And I guess also one-on-one meetings, see who is working on the topic in commission, talk to them, see who they're working with, or maybe even if it's with the EU Parliament, see if you get a meeting with your MEP to have a quick discussion or something like that. Yeah, for sure.
I think probably one of the most beneficial things is seeing what questions they are asking, because that gives you a pretty good idea of what they're considering in this law. So that can also help you very much if you do have a meeting with a policymaker or you do want to have a policy brief. Look at what they're asking and then adapt, right? Like what, because that's what they're talking about behind the more closed doors. So again, not to say you have to sort of adapt yourself and wrap yourselves around their fingers, but just to say, okay, so this is the sticking points because this is what people are talking about. So how does my work fit into that and how can I maybe maximize on understanding that? So sometimes even just reading the questions can be a thought exercise in itself that's quite worthwhile because you see exactly how they're essentially going to design the law. And that applies obviously to roadmaps, which are the earliest phase when they're still crafting the law, but it also applies to consultations because it probably tells you some of the sticking points that are happening behind closed doors as well. You know, what are people actually asking and how can I make that work with what I'm trying to do? Oh, you're on, sorry, I lost you. You're on mute.
No, okay, well, 5 years of Zoom webinars,
I
I've still not
know,
learned
we're all the
anything.
same.
Um, yeah, just thinking about that question about perhaps blockages to scientific participation. Um, Science and knowledge generation tends to be quite the slow process, whereas policy operates in a much faster timeline. How do you think scientists could be better prepared to engage with that? Or if they can reconcile that almost dissonance between the two timelines?
That's the million-euro question. And I can only give my own opinions on this. I don't think there's any perfect answer to that question, but I think we even see it in sort of like what I work on mostly in politics is more long-term issues like climate, for example. I mean, you're not going to solve climate in the next 4 years. But I guess what I would say is, again, coming back to this adaptation of how to communicate with policymakers about the short-term goals and then kind of building it like a timeline. And sometimes it can feel a little bit weird because you're like, okay, but this is very silly and it's only going to work in 2 years. Or the opposite, we're working on future generations where you're like, okay, this is super existential and the politicians don't get it. And I think you have to find a sweet spot to make them relate to short-term goals that lead to your long-term goal. If I just come and say we need to protect the rights of future generations in 2055, I'm not getting a policy meeting. If I come and say, here are some of the impacts of climate change on youth, or here are some of the reasons that, you know, youth are reacting like this in your specific district, country, your mandate, then sometimes they'll bite a little bit more. And it can feel, I mean, politics is politics. Like it can feel a little dirty and weird. But I'd say the most important thing is making it relatable for them in the short term who are thinking about getting reelected, while also making sure you don't compromise your longer term goals. And I think the same is with science. So, you know, why does this study matter to you right now? Like what policy priority does it link with that you currently have as either part of your party or part of your country or part of your mandate? And then you can kind of build it out to be a bit more longer term, but you should focus specifically on, yeah, parties, policies, people. What's their party? What are the things that they're responsible for? Also, don't go to the wrong politician if he's not responsible for it or she's not responsible for it. Then you're wasting time. But just, yeah, keeping the sort of short-term goals in view and then making sure the long-term goal is still with you.
Sure. So basically identify the short-term steps that contribute to your long-term
Yeah.
perspective. Yeah, I remember in conversation with a science diplomat, let's say, who was saying that a lot of people come and say climate change is really bad and we need to solve it. And they're like, yes. And what? Like, yes, I agree, but what about it? But then if
Exactly.
I think they were in um the economic section of their agency, and if people were like, well, climate change is going to have this impact on the
Mhm.
economy, and this is the evidence we have, and these are the solutions you might want to consider, then that's much more of like a viable approach. Then, yeah.
Also with written things, so I mean, you've heard me say this about 5 times probably, but the rest maybe haven't. You know, problem, impact, solution. And the problem needs to be quite specific and the impact needs to be quite tailored to who you're talking to and then come with a solution. Because yeah, everybody, I think the majority of people, if they had 15 minutes with a policymaker, would come inside and say, you know, climate change is bad. But that doesn't really differentiate you from anyone. And it also doesn't propose a solution. And what lobbyists do is propose solutions. So again, coming back to this balance of power, if you don't have a solution that fits your needs, somebody from another lobbying firm will come in with a cleanly printed document with 18 different points and they will put it down, and that will be easier to digest. So yeah, making sure you have a solution, and then making sure, again, you won't have the same pitch to every policymaker. You need to tailor it, and really think also that, what are they responsible for, but also what are their party priorities, etc. If you write the most beautiful two-pager in the world, which I hope you do, two-pager, and you bring the same one to every policymaker, you might not have the sort of effects that you want. Or if you prepare for the meeting in that way without tailoring and thinking about who am I meeting, it might not work. Whereas that's where I guess the more corporate aspect is really, really good, because again, they have sort of a small army of people who do this. That's their whole job. And I know it's not your whole job as scientists. It's not my whole job at the Good Lobby. So we have to be ready to tailor and to adapt so that we have the best possible reactions.
Yeah, I think that's also part of be ready as well, is being reactive sometimes can be looking at a consultation and building around that. But also if you know you have a evidence or solutions you want to contribute, and they're ready, then you can better and more quickly respond to consultations and other things as they come, right? So if you want to engage in policy making and there's nothing there yet, then maybe setting up a kind of little group or document or something, just putting those points together. So when something similar does come along, you can then tailor it to what happens. So be ready to jump, basically. I think it's planned serendipity or something like that. Yeah.
Planned serendipity. I like that. I've never heard that. I see
Yeah.
one in the chat about clarifying the different roles of policymakers, MEPs, EC, and who to follow up. So I will not bore you to tears at your lunch break with the legislative process, but basically the commission is the one who can introduce legislation, and they're the one who can actually they present these open public consultations. So that might be your first step if you're looking at the consultations. Then after it comes out of the commission, it passes through European Parliament and the Council. So all three of those are different independent bodies. And so when you're starting from a public perspective, it's probably easier to look at these public consultations, which is the focus of this session. But then there is definitely an importance of the European Parliament members really kind of giving an opinion, because they also have the power to change the text or to kind of block some of this. The European Parliament tends to be actually the easiest to access and yet the most political. So if, for instance, you're having your first meeting with a policymaker, I would contact someone from your member state in the parliament, but that would be after the commission had already introduced the legislation. So that would be basically step two. Step one would be offering the advice on the consultation. How should the commission prepare it? And then step two would be, okay, so here's what's happening, and can I help it pass or perhaps not pass if I hate it? By reaching out to some of my local members of parliament. Members of parliament tend to be fairly responsive to their constituents, let's put it that way. So I would focus on where your member state is. And the council, I will leave that for another day, but happy to answer questions if you're working on a specific policy file. It's the most political, it's the most difficult to influence. So I would really focus first on having your input put into these public consultations via the commission, and then following up with members of parliament from your region and country once the commission has actually proposed a draft. I don't know, Simon, if you want to add anything.
No, I think that sounds really good. In fact, I think I don't have many more questions left, so we might be wrapping up soon. So if you have any questions for Kelsey, please put them in the chat now. Otherwise, I was wondering, Kelsey, if you had any examples of what a successful scientific contribution might be, for example. Like what are the outcomes for that? If you're successful in a contribution, people, I guess, might reach out to you then. I guess that's the way to build up that relationship.
Yes, I can use one that's mildly successful, but I don't want to jinx it because it's not in the final phases yet. But I'm part of a consortium that's working on ending chemical testing in medical practices on animals. I'm the only non-scientist. I'm there just to guide them through the process, and it's been a long process. But for instance, there's some real experts in this consortium, and we thought we had everything set. And then with the new policy cycle, we realized that the major chemical testing, basically, proposal had been cut. But at the same time, they had invited two of my colleagues to join informal, sort of, shall we say, roadmap exercises. So they went to workshops and they were invited because we had already submitted a lot of information to a public consultation. So they called these two professors and they said, we're trying to save the roadmap. We don't really know how. And here, can you please join us? And so they were in a in-person co-creative workshops. There's been two. And then now, based on somewhat public backlash, this REACH revision is back on the table. So that's kind of the yin and yang of lobbying is, it was off and everybody panicked, and then people said, oh, put it back on, and then they called in the experts and the experts said, please do this. And it's one of the only aspects of this directive that's been saved, has been the chemical testing on animals. A lot of other stuff will be gone, and I'm sorry for those scientists. But for this particular aspect, yeah, basically we submitted a bunch of feedback. They saw that these two women that I work with are the smartest people I've ever met on this topic. So I think they kind of picked up on that. They said, please come talk to us. And then I can't say that it was 100% because of them, because it was a group effort, but it was just an example of the also not to give up in the yin yang of politics, because sometimes the backlash also works. And definitely they have been valued for their expertise. And we've managed to save at least hopefully that part of the directive.
Sure. So in a way, you can answering a consultation can be a way to position yourself, to kind of be seen as an expert later on in other parts of the process, but to be wary of there's like a perhaps slightly fickle, maybe that's not the word, nature to how these things can work. But I think that's one point where scientists can also be ready to kind of jump in, right? Is there's uncertainty. There's uncertainty in terms of solutions, uncertainty in terms of like how these impacts could be communicated, how it could be defined, how it could be evaluated. And as scientists, we're trained to deal with uncertainty. So we should be able to kind of like jump in on that and provide that clarification, depending on what road it is. Yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly. And this is just where I would emphasize again that, the consultation is the baseline, and then you need to really reach out to meet people, because I know that both of those professors like really reached out one-on-one to policymakers saying, we have all the answers you need. They didn't just submit the consultation and say like goodbye. So that's something I would emphasize. I see one last one then question. What are the backgrounds of the people working at the Good Lobby? So none of us are scientists, unless you consider political science to be science, which I don't think most people do. We are mostly lawyers and political scientists, but because we work so much on climate, that's how I met the lovely Simon, and it's how I've become part of this consortium. We tend to basically boost scientists in their efforts to understand the political realm. We ourselves are not scientists, but because we work on climate, we've actually worked quite closely, especially on animal welfare, but also on other climate sort of related topics, to take the research that people are doing and help them figure out how to sort of translate that. So if anyone is sitting here saying, oh wow, I really need political support, don't hesitate to get in touch. But no, we ourselves are not scientists. We're lawyers and political background. I was a campaigner and a lawyer.
Right. I think that's pretty much all our time. So I'll wrap up the session now. Just a reminder that this recording will be published on the EGU YouTube channel in the future. It should be in the next few weeks. Otherwise, I want to thank Kelsey for her time here, everyone who attended for giving their time today, and I wish you a good day. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you all so much, and don't hesitate to get in touch. Thank you also, Simon. It was lovely. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.